Sleeman, who is, among other things, a program manager in charge of replication. And so he's going to talk about the services that we're offering in the replication engine and what it can and cannot do. So, Martin, take it away.
Hey, folks, how you doing? Can you hear me okay back there? Okay, great. My name is Martin Sleeman, and I'm the program manager for replication, which is one of the major parts of AppCenter, as you guys well know. I've heard that you guys have been very excited about this talk because you've been asking lots and lots of replication questions to all the other presenters who had to defer to me. That's great. Please hold off on your questions till the end, and hopefully this presentation will actually answer most of your questions just through the presentation. But if you have other questions, of course, please feel free to ask them at the end. So we're going to talk about three major areas in this talk. We're going to talk about applications and how we can, what is an application, how you can create an application, and how you can add resources to that application. We're also going to talk about replication, of course. And we're going to talk about how we synchronize these applications across the cluster. We're going to talk about staging and deploying. We're going to talk about COM plus deployment because we know that's a really tricky issue. And we're going to talk about how eventing and scripting can sort of play into our replication story to make it really actually enhance our story and to extend it beyond the capabilities that we give you out of the box. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the architecture of how the replication engine and system works. And that, of course, is, has a couple parts to it. We have the replication engine itself. We also have, we'll actually go over a real quick example replication. So let's talk about applications here first. An application center application, right, which is our sort of taking over, or our use of the word application, is really just talking about all the resources that make up a solution. And that means all the resources that make up one of your Windows DNA 2000 applications. For example, you might have a solution called my401k.app, which has your website, DSNs to get back to your SQL database, files, extra files, of course. COM plus applications are part of the solution, probably a huge part of your solution. And, of course, registry keys. You can think of our application or an AppCenter application as a manifest, right? You guys, you tell us what resources make up your application, and you create, and basically we'll take that and actually use it to replicate stuff around. We use it basically as a manifest. You can think of an AppCenter application as a manifest. So here's some UI. I just want to show you to make sure you guys can get familiar with our UI. First off, I'd like to note that we are very proud with AppCenter that we've actually invented time travel to the year 1583 here, which is pretty nice. In this actual UI I'm showing you, we have a dedicated node just for applications. Right? You can basically go to this node, and you can see two other nodes in there. The top frame tells you all about all the applications you have currently defined on your box, and it has all the commands up there for you to click on. And then the bottom frame lists all the resources for a given application. Right? So there can be multiple resources here, but this example just shows one. So you could have an application called, say, My App. It could have like 5 or 6 different resources, like a file resource, a DSN resource, a website, that sort of thing. So when you actually add a one resource I want to emphasize is the website resource, because we know that's very, very important to a lot of people. When you actually add a website as a resource to an AppCenter application, not only will we take that website as far as IIS is concerned, but we'll take the files that are immediately associated with it, i.e. all the files which are pointed to by that virtual site or virtual directory, which is very handy. Now, you might have noticed that there were actually a couple applications predefined on this box for you. Well, how do those applications get created? Well, when you install AppCenter, we will create an application for each virtual server that exists on your box. So if you had 5 virtual servers or 6 virtual servers, you'd have 6 AppCenter applications, one mapping to each one, and you'd get an extra one called the All Sites application. The All Sites application is the application that replicates all the metabase settings not specifically identified in other apps, right? This is sort of our catch-all bucket in case there are metabase virtual sites or virtual directories which aren't specifically noted in another application. So we do that because AppCenter will require that all of the entire metabase is replicated across all machines in the cluster, right? That's why we have that catch-all. We didn't want to just sort of, magically replicate these virtual sites or metabase entries on your machine without giving you at least some idea of why that was happening or some control over it. So to summarize all about apps, you use the user interface, the UI, to create an application. And the application, as far as we're concerned, really is a replication unit. Once you tell us what your solution is, what your application is, what files, what virtual sites, what DSNs, what COM+ apps it is, we can use that to actually replicate it about. You can replicate just that single application, or you could deploy it to a new clean machine, right, and sort of propagate it, make a copy of it to another machine, which can be very, very handy. And of course, the things that we call resources are things like files, COM+ objects, websites, that sort of thing. Okay, now I'm going to jump into the second part, which is all about replication. So first, I hope you've seen the slide already. We're just going to go over some brief terminology. Of course, the servers A, B, and C there are what we consider the web cluster. Those are the machines that are serving the web requests from the internet. And one of those machines will be called the cluster controller, and that's the machine that's got all the has the authoritative source of content, right? This is the one place where you can look at and say, I know that all the content on this cluster controller is going to get replicated and deployed out to all the other cluster members in the cluster. So all the other machines, server B and C, look just like server A in this case. Okay? If you make a change to server B or server C, we're going to overwrite it by the content that's on server A because it's the cluster controller. We also have in this diagram, we have a COM+ app cluster in the back end here, and these are just the servers which just serve COM objects, right, from the front, serve COM objects to the front end web servers. That's all they do in life. So let me just give you the 30-second elevator talk about replication. Okay, so new content is placed on the cluster controller, right? New content appears on that cluster controller. Well, what we will do is we'll automatically push all of that content to all the machines in the cluster, all the cluster members automatically, right? So we're really trying to make this brain dead easy. You defined one of these files to be part of one of your applications, and whenever that file gets updated, whoosh, we will actually push it out to all the machines in the cluster and keep them all synchronized without you having to do any interference or to talk or to do any sort of user intervention at all. Now let's go into some more details about this. As I talked about before, applications define what the heck AppCenter is going to replicate, right? If you tell us to replicate this file, by gosh, we'll do it. But we're not going to figure out that, oh, this file is needed to be replicated because I talked about this other resource, this other DSN, this other COM+ object. If you tell us what to replicate, we'll be happy to do it for you, but you have to tell us by defining an application. These applications, of course, are defined by the resources that they contain, the files, the reg keys, WMI settings, CAPI, and network settings, actually. Of course, we also will deal with COM objects, ISAPI filters and extensions, and all that kind of good stuff. As I alluded to earlier, we're also single master replication, right? We only have a single master that has the authoritative source of all content. Now, we made this choice because we felt that was a natural fit with most websites. A lot of times, you only want to have a single master machine that you can be guaranteed is the cluster controller and has the authoritative source of content. I mean, could you imagine a world where a hacker managed to get into one of your machines in your cluster, wipes out or changes that information, and it gets automatically replicated out to all the other machines in the cluster? We thought that was a bad idea, and that we only have a single authoritative source, which would be the cluster controller. And another big replication goal is for us to be able to stage and deploy content across a firewall. We know that a lot of people have very complex publishing systems nowadays, where you might have CRS or some other content management system, And what might happen is you might have a couple steps of Q&A and checking things out and development process on one side of the firewall, right, which is connected, say, to your corporate network. And then you have this big old firewall in the middle. And then you have your production servers over here. And to get them from your sort of development environment, you have to go through a firewall. Well, we've designed AppCenter with that in mind so that we can actually push content across a firewall really easily. Okay, so I've given you the good news. Here's sort of the bad news, right? These are some of our non-goals. We don't want to do multi-master replication because A, it's really difficult, and B, as I said before, we consider it not to be the greatest match in the whole world for how the web really works and how websites, high-end websites really work. We're not all about full application deployment. We're not SMS. We're not trying to deploy Office 2000 to 7,000 desktops. We're very, very focused about deploying web applications to a cluster of servers that all look alike. We don't do account propagation. We're not the DS. We would highly recommend that you run in a DS environment, that you have a domain, so that when you want to do complicated authentication or use lots of different user accounts, you can do that. But we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that for you with a slight caveat, which I'll get to later. We unfortunately don't do SQL data replication right now. We'd love to do it, but it was a very expensive item for us to do. And frankly, the SQL team has a fantastic replication technology out there already. What we would like to do in future is to better integrate with the SQL replication team so that we can make this more seamless. But right now, we don't do any SQL data replication ourselves. We will make you go out and sort of tickle the SQL replication system to make it do its replication. We also don't do heterogeneous replication. What that means is we assume that all the machines in your cluster look identical. They're exactly the same. If you have a C drive on one machine, you'll have a C drive in all the machines. If you have an E drive, you'll have an E drive everywhere. We don't get into the business of trying to translate or map from one drive to another or one type of resource to another. So everything we assume will be absolutely homogeneous across the entire cluster. We're also not a web content management system. We don't do versioning, check-in, check-out, any of that stuff. We will, we're going to work well with that type of system, but we're not going to take on that extra feature set. We also talked to a lot of our customers, and we asked them, hey, would you guys like to have your content pushed out really, really fast with some significant CPU hit maybe on the cluster controller, or do you want us to slow it down to a trickle and never sort of exercise your cluster controller? The overwhelming response that we found was that they wanted to get the content out there as quickly as possible. And so we do not throttle the bandwidth that we take up on the network or the CPU. Now, one note here, don't freak out about, oh my gosh, we're going to take up all your bandwidth on your front-end NIC or on the NIC that's connected to the internet. We will do all of our replication on a back-end NIC, so a NIC that's not facing the internet. So we think that's an okay sort of choice that we made there. We also don't do any compression or encryption of data. We felt that the compression wasn't worth the extra CPU cycles it would take, and the encryption we felt wasn't necessary because we'll be pushing all of our content across the back-end NIC, back-end LAN. It should be okay. But just in case, we will encrypt all very sensitive information, for example, passwords, that sort of thing. So just want to let you know about that. So let's talk about some common scenarios now. Let's talk about synchronizing your cluster. I mean, this is a thing that you want to have happen all the time. Well, we do that for you automatically. We call it the automatic synchronization job. And what this means is the cluster is synchronized in real time. So as I showed you before in that 30-second overview, as soon as content, or in most cases it's files, as soon as files pop up on the machine, they will get pushed out to every machine in the cluster, right? The cluster controller will wake up and say, oh, this has changed, push it out, and you're done. No interference, or there's no need for you guys to intervene or step in. Of course, this works for all the resource types I've talked about, files, reg keys, metabase, all that kind of good stuff. Now, a lot of other folks might say, you know what, I need more control. I don't want you to do this for me automatically. I want to manually synchronize my cluster. Okay, great. Well, you can turn off the automatic synchronization and control it yourself. You can hit a button, and then we'll go synchronize. And what we'll do is we'll update all out-of-date content. And that's really handy if you believe that someone's actually messed with one of your cluster member machines, and you don't know quite what they did, but you just want to clean it up anyways. just hit the synchronize that server, or to synchronize that one server, and we'll take care of all the we'll update all of the out-of-date content. Now, another thing to note is that if you have a large website, say, I don't know, Microsoft.com, which is at least 30 gigs, we don't want us to send all the content over to all the servers all the time. I mean, that would just be silly. So what we do is we actually detect the changes when we do a full sync and say, oh, well, I've got these 15 files, you've got 14 files, so I'll just send you this one file you don't have. So we're really smart about what data we send. And then the last thing I want to mention here in general about replication is that we send all of our content across to all of the machines, make sure it arrives at the machines and is put in a temporary location, and then apply it. So this helps, but doesn't solve, but it helps with the consistency problem, where you have 1,000 files, and while you're applying those 1,000 files, things are a little inconsistent. Well, we try and help that situation by making sure all the files are on the machine before we try and apply them. One thing I want to talk about with automatic replications is that for a variety of, well, reasons, you might miss a change notification, right? What happens if you're updating a file at the same exact moment that your machine is really, really busy, or for some reason a change notification gets dropped on the floor and we miss it? Well, what we will do is we'll do a cleanup replication every 60 minutes or every 10 minutes or whatever you tell us, right? We found through experience with CRS that once a day maybe we might drop some sort of notification. So to protect ourselves and make sure that the content is in sync across the entire cluster at all times, every hour we're going to do a cleanup, full synchronization, just to double check that all the correct content is on all the machines at the same time, which we think is very important. Now, you can actually go and change this from the cluster properties. Right now, it's a default of 60 minutes, but you can change that from anything from every 5 minutes if you're really paranoid to every day, which if you really have a lot of faith in it, which we found actually works out. I would personally recommend that you just do it once a day. Okay, so let's talk about synchronizing a cluster. So here's sort of a snippet of the UI. And there's the Synchronize the Cluster button. And what that's going to do is it's going to say, all right, here's the cluster controller, and here are all the members. Synchronize all the content from the cluster controller to each and every member to make sure that they're all in sync. So just to do that, you just click the button and it goes. Now, when you do that, the synchronization area of the UI will update and tell you what's going on. It'll say, hey, guess what? I'm initializing, I'm sending data, I'm applying, I'm successful. It'll sort of update its status as it's going along with these synchronizations, which is very handy. Now, sometimes you don't want to do this across all the machines in your cluster. Sometimes you just want to do it to one machine because you know that someone just messed with one particular machine and you want to fix it. So you can do that too. You just select the machine in the scope pane, the left-hand pane up here, and then you just click Synchronize, and it will just synchronize from the cluster controller to that one machine, which saves you some bandwidth and stuff like that. Then, of course, the Synchronize section will also update for this too. Now, finally, if you actually want to only synchronize a particular application because you know that you've updated that application, you can do that too. You just go to the Applications node, as I showed you before, and you hit the Synchronize button. And there's also an option here that you can synchronize all, which will synchronize every application across all the servers. Now, this is very, very similar to the Sync All button, or it does exactly the same work as the Synchronize All or Synchronize the Cluster button. Now, I'm actually going to switch over to a demo here. Okay, and let's just go for it. This is our UI. This is live. This is build 132, which is yesterday's build. And if you look here in the UI, you see the very top says Application Center Server. It says Darth Cluster. That's the name of my cluster. I'm a big Star Wars fan, if you couldn't tell. And underneath that, you see IIS, Internet Information Services. This is just a snap-in for IIS. I wanted to do this because it's very, very easy for me to show you that we actually do pick up meta-based changes if I have this snap-in involved here already. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my cluster controller, which is called Martin-HB2AS. and I'm going to go create a new virtual site. And I'm going to hit next here, and I'm going to type in demo, and I'm going to give it port 8181. And now I'm going to give it a path. Now, one thing I want to show you before I click on this path is to promise or to show you that I'm not actually pulling your leg. Now, if you look here, here's Martin HP1, right? And that is the member machine, the cluster member machine. And you notice that there isn't a fun stuff directory on this machine, right? That file, those files, that directory does not exist on this machine. But if I go down here to the cluster controller, which is HP2AS, I'm sorry, the names aren't more intuitive, you'll notice you have a fun stuff directory there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create a website that points to the fun stuff directory. I'm going to show you how that website gets replicated to the member machine, and these files also get replicated. So let's just go down here and finish creating this website. And see here, let's go down to local drive D and go to fun stuff. Okay, next. Turn on browse just in case. And now what it's doing is it's actually gone and created that virtual site right there. Now you can see it there in the eyes snap in, and you notice it's actually not on Martin HP1AS. And the reason it's not there is because I've actually turned off automatics right now, right? It's not there. Honest to goodness, there's nothing up my sleeves, honest. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to the applications here. I'm going to define a new application and show you how you can sync that application across. Okay, so these are the applications defined for my cluster, right? These applications are cluster-wide. So let's go create a new one. So we'll hit the new button here. We'll call it my demo. Hit OK. And you have to excuse me. These are I'm actually using Terminal Server, which is a really great product, to go back to my machines in my office. So that's why it's a little slow. And we'll just click on my demo here, and then select a website. Hit Add. And what we're doing here is we're actually just going to add the demo website. Now you notice the demo shows up here. We're just enumerating all the websites that exist on this machine. We're going to hit OK. And now, when you look down here, you'll notice that that successfully got updated. But if you go back to the II snap-in, which is over here on the left, you notice it's there, but it's still not on Martin 1. So what we're going to do next is we're actually just going to go to the cluster and just say synchronize the entire cluster. And it's going to say, are you sure? And we hit OK. And then we're going to actually start that. It's going to take a couple minutes because there's a lot of content involved with this. So while it's doing that, I'd like to take a single question. Anybody got a question? Somebody's got to have a question. Question? Okay. The question is, what's the granularity of the replication? How do we check to see if a file is out of sync, right? And it depends on what type of content you're talking about. Files are different from the metabase, which are different from reg keys. But for your particular question, which was about the files, what we do is we take a look at sort of the signature of the file, which we call the name, the size, the date timestamp, the attributes. And if any one of those have changed, we'll send it across. So let's go check in back on this machine here. And it looks like we're still initializing. Let's just refresh it here a little bit. OK, now it said success. So let's go over here and cross our fingers and say nice things to the demo gods to see if we actually got the new website there. And voila, there's the website, right? So this is just a great example of, hey, I just hit this synchronize button, and boom, it goes. Or if you turn on automatics, you don't have to do that. You just create it, you walk away, come back, it'll be there. Now, you're probably asking yourself, well, OK, that's nice about the metabase. But what about those files? Let's see if those files got there. So let's go to Martin HP1, which is the member machine here. And here, look, here they are. There's some files right there. So that demo just shows you that our replication story is very easy, very succinct, and it works. So that's some great stuff. So let's just go back to the demo slides here. And any questions on that? Question? So the question is, did it inherit the metabase properties from like the core, the root, right? Or the W3 SVC? The answer is yes. We'll take the entire metabase from one machine and put it on the other. So we'll do the inheritance correctly. Okay, so I've showed you actually how you can create new content, how it synchronizes, which I think is really exciting. And I want to tell you next about how you can update content. So now you've actually created this stuff, how can you update stuff? Well, if you use front page, Office, or DAV, or anything that uses DAV, you can actually either edit your content from the back end, your back end land, or you can do it from the front end. And what's cool about doing it from the front end is that we will bounce you to the cluster controller all the time automatically. So you don't have to worry about it at all. You can also use an existing content replication system like CRS, which is actually called Content Deployment Service, which is part of Site Server 3. That's a great product. I used to work on that product. You could use that as part of this system. So you could have CDS pushing to, say, a staging machine, and then we take over from there and just take care of the rest of the cluster for you. You could even use Xcopy or Notepad. But of course, the caveat there is that you better do it to the cluster controller, or your changes will be pretty short-lived, right? As soon as that cluster controller kicks off again, it's going to wipe out your changes, which would be kind of a bummer. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's great, but you know what? I need to test my content before I put it out there. I need to make sure that the content's okay before I turn it on, full out on my entire cluster. So how can I use a test server, right, with test content? Well, you can do that with AppCenter. What we would do is say, okay, designate one of your machines in your cluster as the test machine, and then you can take that machine out of the replication loop. So if we went back to an early example, or just in general, you could take one machine out of the replication loop, which means that every time you do a full synchronization or an automatic synchronization, which is done by the system, it won't get updated. So while that machine is not getting any new content from the cluster controller, it still gets hits from load balancing, right? So people are still hitting it and all that kind of good stuff. So it's very important that, it's very handy for you to actually go and start playing with that machine, because once it's out of the replication loop, guess what? You could go and Xcopy stuff onto it, CRS stuff to it directly, mess with it, just by actually at the keyboard, and actually see that content in real live production use without it being on every machine and giving you a lot of heartache at night. So again, the server's content is controlled by the user, and then after you've tested it in production, if you'd like, for a while, you can then push that content from that one machine back to the cluster controller, and that would then update all the other machines. Or you could take that one machine, that one test machine, and make it the cluster controller if you wanted to. Either choice. Either way, it's great. Now, another big question people always have is, that cluster controller sounds like a single point of failure. What's going to happen? Well, if that cluster controller falls over, the most important thing to remember is that your website's still up. All the other machines, depending on how the cluster controller fell over, but all the other machines, for certain, will be serving web content. So you're not going to have an outage. That's the most important thing. Now, you won't be able to update content on the cluster because the cluster controller's down. But everybody will be serving content. Now, to fix this, if you know your cluster controller is going to be down for a while, what you can do is very quickly and easily elect a new cluster controller. So you say, okay, that machine, we know it's not coming back for at least an hour. We have to do a content update. Let's go select this machine, which looks just like the cluster controller in most cases, right, in 99% of the time, let's put it that way, and then make that the cluster controller. You bless it, it turns into a cluster controller, and you can start updating content again, and you can just keep going. And when that cluster controller comes back to life, he can rejoin the cluster and figure out that he's no longer the cluster controller and rejoin as a cluster member. So it's a pretty good story there. I do want to mention Commerce and BizTalk because they're very important products, part of our division. We will support Commerce Server and BizTalk sites as part of our clusters. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to do lots and lots of great integration work inside the product for it, but we will be producing some white papers to discuss this topic in depth. Now let's get to the topic which you are probably all wondering about. It's like, okay, files, metabase, that's easy. Let's talk about ISAPI global filters and COM objects. I mean, that's the hard part. Well, we have to first off treat those differently, right? Because as you know, those COM objects and ISAPI global filters can do things like lock files and their state issues. and also usually have to stop IIS just to get the darn thing done correctly. So what we do is we try and automate this for you as much as we can, and we'll also give you some hooks so that you can take over and go the last 10, 20% of the way if our automatic solution doesn't work for your very specialized application. And another thing to know about this is that we're not going to do this willy-nilly or in the automatic mode, as I've mentioned before. We only do this on demand because, of course, since we have to stop the IIS service, we don't want this to happen unless you're really ready for it. So let's just go through what we do when we do a component deployment. Okay? The first thing we do is we take the server offline. And when I say offline, I mean offline in terms of load balancing, right? And we will be doing this. We're investigating how we can integrate with some third-party load balancers. And we haven't decided exactly how much we can do here, but we're definitely in talks with these folks, and we hope to be able to work very well with some third-party load balancing solutions so we can take those machines offline too. So basically, if you have, say, a Cisco local director or Big IP or Alteon or some other type of load balancing device, we can deal with it. And that's definitely our goal. So we take the server offline, out of the load balancing loop. We wait for it to drain connections, 10, 20 minutes or whatever. And then we're going to stop services. We're going to stop Commerce if it's running. We're going to stop IIS if it's running. That should open up and unlock all the files that we need in the 80% case. Then we're going to stop this Com Plus application, right? We'll install a new version of it, and we'll restart it, and then we'll restart all the services that we stopped. So, without any intervention, we believe that this should cover the 80% case of COM application deployment for AppCenter, which we think is great. Now, we know that we can't quite get to 100%. Right? We know that there's always going to be some great applications you guys write, which we just can't know about what needs to be done to install it correctly. So we want to make sure that you can script it so that you can get to that 100% level. Again, let's just talk about what you can do. For example, you could write scripts to take a server offline, stop additional apps and services, replicate the components, start the apps, bring the servers back online, and then test it if you had some extra scripts to test it. And then you could repeat this for a number of servers. Now let me just show you a quick demo, or not really a demo, but just sort of an example file here. Let's make this bigger. Let's see. Okay, so this little batch file I wrote here is just very simply going to stop some services, which is, in this case, SQL Server in my application, which is a service. It then uses our command line interface for AppCenter called AC Deploy, which you probably saw earlier, to actually replicate the My Demo app from the cluster controller to the cluster member, in this case, Martin HP2 to Martin HP1 AS. And then what we'll do is and what that deploy actually does, it does multiple steps, right? It stops IIS, installs the app, restarts IIS. So all you have to do in your batch file or your script is to restart the services which you stopped. And then, if you'll notice here, there's a line that says call test app.bat, right? And that's just calling out to another batch file which tests it. And this can do whatever you want, right? This can double check the interfaces are OK, the access permissions are OK, or whatever you guys decide is your QA bar. Then, if it's successful, if you get for basically this if exist line, it's all about we write out a test OK file if everything went OK. If that file exists, then what we'll do is we'll go put that machine back in the loop, right? And you actually see another AppCenter command line command there called AC Load Balance, which will actually allow you to re-enable and put Martin HP1 AS back into the load balancing loop. And if it failed, well, you don't put it back in the loop. You echo, failed. You write a fail text, something or other, and then you can use all that monitoring, which Alex Sutton talked about earlier, to actually alert you in more ways like email and do extra actions and that kind of thing. But I just wanted to show you that it would be very easy to create a batch file or or a script, a VBS script, to do some really extensive component deployment stuff. We give you some tools, and you guys can go run with them and do even more than what we provide you, even though we do feel that we covered the 80% case. Okay. So now I've talked about deploying these apps. Let's talk about how you can make our lives easier and make your own lives easier by creating apps which are already sort of friendly to AppCenter. First off, use Com Plus apps if you can. If you're building something from scratch, just create it out of Com Plus because that's what we replicate. If it's a COM Classic application, that's okay. That's okay. We can actually just convert that from a COM Classic DLL to a COM Plus application in about a minute flat in the UI. It's very, very easy to do. I do it all the time. Another thing to do is don't use cross-references and keep your components isolated, right? As I said, what we're trying to do here is stop the services which might be locking your files or your components open, right? And so since we feel that almost all components are just instantiated from the web service, if we stop IIS, we should be in great shape. But let's say you had two components. If they call into each other like this, guess what? Now you have to write some script for you to be able to successfully install them. If they didn't, if they just used IIS, then guess what? You don't have to write script. We can take care of it for you. So that's why I say be very careful about using cross-references, or don't use them unless you have to. And of course, since we like stop and start these components all the time without your knowledge, well, with your knowledge, but without any specific code to tell your app to stop, don't keep your state in there. I think almost all of you do this already, but keep your state in the SQL database or in a file or something else, so that if we stop and restart the app, it won't wipe things out. Now, one question a lot of people have about this is, okay, so I have this component, and I want to go test it on a single box, sort of like I test content out. And I sure as heck do not want to push this new, quote-unquote, maybe dangerous, maybe AVing, right, component out to all of my servers at the same time. How can we fix this? Well, we can allow you, via this deployment wizard, which I'll talk about in just a second, we can allow you to sort of do a phased deployment of your component across the cluster. Right now it's not in the code, so I can't demo it for you, but it will be soon. So let's just walk through this wizard. So you say, hey, I want to deploy my component or my application to these sets of machines. How do I do it? Well, you start with the deployment wizard. You say, hey, do I want to deploy my content within the cluster or outside the cluster? If you select outside the cluster, we will make sure to ask for credentials so that we're not accepting replications from untrusted sources. And then what you do is you say, hey, what apps do I want to replicate? Again, this reinforces the point of you tell us what the apps are, what resources are in your apps, and then you can decide later how you want to deploy them. You can deploy one app or 5 apps. And once you decide which apps you want to deploy, you can tell us which machines to deploy to. So in this case, there are 8 servers in this cluster. If you know this has been a very well-tested COM component and you want to push it out quickly, what you could do is push it out to half the machines, wait a bit, and then push it out to the other half. In this case, it would be 4 and 4, right? So this allows you to push out to 1, 2, 3, 4, or n number of machines in your cluster, which is very handy if you want to be very conservative by pushing to one machine, or if you want to be slightly more bold by pushing out to, say, half your machines. Once you decided which machines you're going to push to or deploy to, then we give you these options about deploying the COM Plus apps or deploying the ISAPI filters. And by the way, this does apply to both. When I say COM Plus apps, I also mean ISAPI filters at the same time, right? Basically the same sort of steps have to occur. So we give you the option to replicate your COM Plus apps there, and we warn you that, yeah, we're going to take down your web server for a second here, and then you're done. And when you hit the finish button here, we'll start deploying these COM Plus objects to the servers which you told us to. Now, another part of the story is that, okay, that's great. I like this idea of pushing applications from one machine to another machines, but I want a machine which I just used just to test out applications to test load. Well, that's what we would call a stager. And stagers are great because they're so flexible. A stager is a machine that is not a member of a cluster. It's just a server which has got AppCenter on it all by itself, right? What you can use that stager to do is you can have that one stager push out to lots of different clusters. So if you have, say, 40 machines in 4 different clusters, you have one stager which then, if you think about it, becomes a new authoritative source of content pushed out to each one of those 4 clusters, right? So you have one point to manage for the content, but guess what? It's controlling the content in 4 different clusters, which is great. You can act as a test and golden server. And also, of course, you could use it in the development process, right? Not only can you can put the component on there and bang on it, and when your QA department says it's okay, you push it out. And you can also use it just as the extra backup, just in case one of your cluster controllers gets messed up. Another cool thing about a stager is that you can actually create slightly tweaked applications that have slightly different resources and push them at 2 different clusters. For example, on a stager, you could have My App 1 and My App 2. My App 1 has a COM component on it and a website. My App 2 has a COM component, or has a website and a DSN. And those resources could actually overlap so that you could have one app which has got 3 different resources push out to the front-end servers, and then another app which just has, say, the COM components push out to another cluster of servers, say the COM plus load balance servers in the back end. So that's pretty handy there. And here's just a diagram to illustrate my point again. You have a stager, and that stager can push out to 2, 3, 4 clusters. And that one stager then controls the content on all these machines, and it's in one place, which is really, really handy. Now let's talk about eventing. As Alex talked about before, eventing is a big and very integral part of our product. And replication, of course, is going to take advantage of this. Replication is going to fire many events in general, and it will also fire events for each object replicated, if you want it to. Now, we can sort of consider that a sort of a test environment, because doing that will have a performance hit. But on the other hand, it's really great to know when a specific file or reg key or metabase entry did get replicated. And if you have to show people that, yes, this got there, you can do that by turning on these per object events. We will also fire events after a replication has completed. Now, what's cool about this is that you could write, using Healthmon, you could write a script that looks for this I'm done event, basically, from replication. And then you could write a script to do something after you're done. For example, if you want to, say, kick off an index, or compress something, or delete some old files, or do whatever, you could do that by watching for this I'm done replication event and then running a script afterwards. Now, not only can we sort of, not only does replication kick off events saying, hey, this is where we're at and we're done and that kind of thing, but as I showed you before, for component deployment, you also have the ability to script deployment, which means that you could build these complicated, wonderful scripts that do a whole bunch of work to install your application, and you could leverage us to make sure it gets there, to make sure you install things and do reg serves correctly, that kind of thing. So it can save you a lot of work. In this example, this AC deploy command will deploy an application. In this case, it's 3 apps, apps 1, 2, and 3, from the controller 0 to 2 targets, server 1 and server 2. So again, this is great for you guys to be able to use this so that you can schedule deployments, so you can enhance, and also so you can enhance your own component deployment story, which I think is going to be really handy for a lot of you. So let's put it all together here for a second. You could use, as I said, replication fires a lot of events. You could use scripting to create these very elaborate component deployment scenarios. And then you can use Healthmon to monitor your application to make sure it did OK. You could say, for example, watch for a failure event and then react. You could take a machine offline. You could page somebody. You could send a net message. You could put up a dialog box. You could turn a light red, whatever. And also, you could use Healthmon, as I said. That's the mechanism you use to actually kick off a script once the replication is completed. So to summarize, replication is all about, some of you guys work, it's all about synchronizing with cluster. It's all about synchronizing a particular server or a particular application. So you can actually go down to any one of these levels of granularity to make sure that everything's in sync. We also support test content servers, which we know is very important for a lot of you to have a machine out there which you control the content on completely without having to worry about replication, which is getting real live load, so you can test stuff. And after that, of course, you can then push that content, make changes to the content, test it some more, or put it on the rest of the cluster. We support component deployment. So we will deploy correctly, and we know that we'll get like 80% of this right just out of the bag. But we also know that there's some very complicated and clever components out there which will require extra work on your part to deploy them correctly, which is why we made it extensible, right? That's why we have our scripting and command line events there. And of course, I just talked about the scripting and eventing, which allows you to do an after replication script, or actually just to monitor replication to make sure it went OK. So now I'm going to talk about the architecture really quite quickly here. So once upon a time, there was this PM who decided to create a replication system called CRS. And he decided to create his own protocol, and that would be me. And I learned a couple things doing that. The first thing is you don't want to create your own protocol. The reason that you don't want to create your own protocol is because you have to debug the darn thing and do all this extra work which is already provided for you by existing protocols which have already been debugged. So I learned from that mistake and decided that, now don't get me wrong, CRS, after a lot of work, is now very, very reliable. But we've learned that it's a lot quicker to get to that point if you just use an existing protocol. So in this release of AppCenter, we use HTTP and XML and other standards like TCP/IP to do the cross-server communication. So we don't have to worry about debugging that stuff. We have a two-tier architecture. We have an engine, which is the core of the replication system, which is all worried about security and the cross-server communication. And then on top of that engine, we have drivers. And we have a driver for each and every content type that we replicate. So before, when I was talking about metabase, replication, files, and reg keys, and DSNs, and websites, guess what? Each one of those has their own driver. And those drivers are responsible for reading, writing, detecting new changes or new versions of those content types, and then replicating them. So you have a driver for files which knows how to read a file, write a file, oh, the file's been changed, compare files back and forth, that sort of thing. So what's cool about this architecture is that it allows you to extend it. So eventually, for example, we could perhaps, I'm not saying we're doing it, but we could perhaps add a driver for SQL, right? Or we could add a driver for MP3 files or whatever, and that's not a very good example because it's a file. But if there's a new content type out there, so for example, say an exchange store, we could write a driver to deal with exchange stores in future. Another big part of our architecture is that we have a two-phase process. We send the content to a machine and then apply it. And we do this, as I said before, to make sure that there isn't, well, to help reduce the inconsistent state. So if you have 5,000 files and you're applying them as you receive them, guess what? You have to worry about that network latency. And you might have a longer state where you're actually out of sync. So by putting it on the local drive for a while, it actually helps reduce this inconsistent state. And again, there are two types of replication. There's the full sync, which is initiated by the user, and it checks all the resources. What it does is basically says, the cluster controller says, these are all the files and all the resources I have. Boom. And it sends that list to all of the member machines in its cluster. Those member machines take that list, and they compare it to what they've got. They say, OK, well, thank you, cluster controller. I know you've got 58 things, and I checked my own stores, and I know I need 3 of them. So it sends a message back, or each member sends a message back to the cluster controller saying, please send me these following objects. And then the cluster controller will then send those objects to each one of those cluster members. So that's for the full sync. And of course, this is also used for staging and deploying. And then we also have an automatic sort of replication, which is real-time synchronization. So as things change, we'll notice the changes, and we'll push them out to other machines. Now, I did want to mention a word or two about security. We know it's very, very important to you that we have a very secure product, especially with all these denial of service attacks of late. We have reviewed all of our features for security. We've reviewed all of our interfaces for security. We are doing buffer overrun attacks to make sure that we are a secure product. Not only that, but we want to make sure that in the staging and deploying scenario where you might have a staging machine, a firewall, and then your production cluster, that we work well with that firewall. So what we do is we go over a single port so that it's very easy for you to write a very strict filter that says, you know what, this one stager box can initiate a connection in this direction to only this box, okay, and nothing else, right? So we know that it's hard enough to write a secure firewall as it is. So we just want to make it as easy as we could for you guys, and that's why we only use one port. We'll also encrypt secure information when we replicate it. So nothing that should be, how do I put it? All passwords will be encrypted, so nothing's going to be sent in clear text that shouldn't be. We also authenticate all of our connections. So every time you have a cluster controller talk to a member, the first thing that happens is they say, hey, who the heck are you? are you the right person to be able to do this replication to me? Because we know it's could be a destructive act. And so we actually have our own user account called ACSC, which is specifically installed by us to make sure that the authentication works okay. Also, of course, you have to be an administrator to admin the cluster. And one final word about security is that I would highly recommend that you guys use a domain in your web environment. And that's because it allows you, with AppCenter, to create applications that rely on specific accounts being there, or to do this sort of authentication like we do. And to get that full advantage, you have to use a domain so that we have we can replicate a domain ACL on a file and have it work across all the machines. So to summarize the entire talk, and also just this architecture area, we have a two-tier architecture. We only send change data. A full sync will compare all of the items, all the resources on the cluster controller against the members, and automatic will send changes as they occur. So that ends the formal presentation part of my talk. I'd like to take some questions. There. The question is, what's the difference between a stager and a cluster controller? The only real difference is that a stager is not part of a cluster. Right? A cluster controller actually affects other machines, right, that are inside of its cluster. So if you change a metabase setting on that cluster controller, the metabase change will be propagated to all the other members of that cluster. Stager, it's all by itself. Another question? Question? Can you do deployment over a WAN? Great question. You could do it. We're not going to test that scenario. We're not going to actually put any special hardware to simulate a WAN, but theoretically you could do it. Question in the back. Yeah, I understand your point. The comment was, gee, if I only have 2 machines in my cluster and I have to take the machine out of the loop for a while to update, isn't that kind of harsh? And the unfortunate reality is, yeah, it is kind of harsh. Microsoft is working on making it so we don't have to do this, but for right now we're kind of stuck with this scenario. So we're trying to approach it the best that we can. So next question. Yes, lady. The question is, do we take a machine offline just for COM apps, or do we do it whenever anything's changed? And the answer is, we only take a machine offline if you're replicating a COM plus app, right? And that's because we have to. We don't want to, but that's because we have to. Follow up. That's correct. The question is, so therefore IS does not lock files, and the answer is, that's correct. IS does not lock files with IS version 5. Mm-hmm. I didn't quite get that last part.
So how would it work while you're serving content in the production environment and your controller is replicating? I mean, at what point will it start serving the new one?
Okay. Okay, so the question is, so this machine is serving web content, and you're updating it. When are we going to know that the new version is going to be served? Well, it actually depends on what the content is and how the caching mechanism of IS works. But safe to say that as soon as it actually detects the file's been changed, it'll flush its cache and start serving the new object. Question? Absolutely. I mean, that's a great point. The question was, but if coherency is really, really important to you, you can take a machine offline, update it completely, and then bring it back online, which is completely correct. Mm-hmm.
I thought content replication service for Power Server was going away with Power Server 2000.
CRS will not ship as part of Comma Server 2000. We are, the sort of successor to it.
Okay, so meaning all the capabilities you have in CRS, do you have here?
The question is, do all the capabilities we have in CRS get transferred magically to AppCenter? Unfortunately not. We thought it was the best stuff and the stuff that people really wanted. We are very aware that there's not all of it there, but we feel that we're serving a really, how to put it, this feature set will serve our target audience, which is all about replicating within a cluster. Question in the back. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question, to summarize, is that I've got this middle tier of COM Plus servers, and I want to update, say, one of them. Do the other ones have to go offline? And the answer is no. The staging, or the deployment wizard, which I showed you up there, allows you to select how many machines in that cluster that you want to take offline and update at once. So you can select one machine, for example, update that one machine, make sure it's OK, and then repeat the process on the other machines. It's up to you. Question over here? Other questions? Yes? Great question. The question is does AppCenter help you to find your dependencies? Does it help you say that, OK, this ASP file requires this COM Plus app, which requires a DSN? And unfortunately, no. We would love to do that, but it's a very, very difficult problem. And so for this version, you have all the brains and the smarts on this issue. You will tell us what resources are needed. And eventually, we do hope to address that situation better in future. But for now, you have to tell us. Question, ma'am. Sure. The question is, can you elaborate on cleanup replication? To elaborate, a cleanup replication is a replication that occurs every n number of minutes, and that's a range between 0 minutes and 1,440, which is a day. Okay? So every, let's say, hour, which is the default, what's going to happen is that we'll kick off a full sync replication. That's what happens, right? And what that full sync replication does is it gives the cluster controller gives out a list saying, this is all the stuff I have on my machine. Has everybody got that same list? And it looks very, down its nose at everybody else. If they don't, then it sends them those updates. It sends those machines the updates to guarantee that everybody's in sync all the time. Question?
So if you're not going to support LAN staging, now staging steps from replication, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
It's the same technology, but the question is staging and replication the same thing? Well, sort of.
replication's ongoing, right?
Can be, sure.
Okay. So what's the recommended practice for doing LAN?
Okay. The question is, what is the recommended practice for doing WAN replication if AppCenter doesn't support it? Well, CRS would be a good solution there. Xcopy, if you've got a good link. Other solutions which you have, even Robocopy, for example, could take care of that for you. Eventually, we're going to look more at that space, but not right now. Question, sir? Question about Active Directory. Great point. We don't do any Active Directory replication per se because they do it on their own. But I think that we actually have how to put our story, the AppCenter story, is enhanced by Active Directory. For example, I said before, we're not all about application deployment. For example, if you add a clean machine that's just got Win2K on itself to a cluster, guess what? We're not going to install AppCenter on it for you. You have to do that manually. But with the Active Directory, I could sure see a method where you add a machine to a cluster, which also means it's being added to a specific domain or OU, which means it gets AppCenter installed on it. And then all I have to do is do some magic to run a script, for example, which also you could do via group policy in the Active Directory to have it add itself to the cluster. So no, we don't, to answer your question specifically, no, we don't do anything specific with Active Directory because we don't want to assume that you have a DS in your DMZ. But we sure as heck think it would be an advantage. Question, ma'am. The question is, okay, I did mention something about this domain and having a domain ACL replicated across the cluster. What I'm saying there is that we replicate ACLs on files and some other objects like registry keys, right? If you have an ACL associated with a file that says, Redmond, which is our domain here at Microsoft, Redmond/MartinSL, which is my identifier, and you replicate that for one machine to all the other machines which are in that domain, guess what? That account's valid, right? It's going to be valid across all the machines. But let's say you're not in a domain. Let's say you're just in a work group. Well, there is no Redmond, so I guess I'll say computer1/MartinSL, right? When I replicate that to computer 2, guess what? That's no longer a valid account. It'll break things. So that's why it's so important, and that's why I encourage everybody to run a domain, because then you can start using ACLs really effectively and replicate the ACLs about. Question, sir? Will auditing? The question is, will auditing on files be replicated? And as far as I know, I don't think so. I need to double check on that, but I don't think so. A question, sir? Okay. The question is hardware requirements. And I said they have to all be homogeneous. What does that really mean? And what that really means is that we don't care what brand you buy, but you better have a C drive in all the machines and a D drive. They don't have to be exactly the same size, but they better have enough free space so that we can replicate the content correctly. Also, it should have some extra space on those drives because, as I said, we write all the data before we apply it. So you better have some extra space on there so that we have some space to actually have a temp area. Error. The question is, if you don't have enough space, what happens? And the answer is we error out, and we throw some events that say, hey, we don't have enough space. Hey, what's up? Question. So the question is, how do we handle the case of a UNC name being part of a resource? We ignore it. Question. Question. Great question. So do we have the ability to export or import app definitions? I mean, you spend all this time figuring out all the dependencies and stuff. Boy, wouldn't it be nice to be able to export them? Unfortunately, right now, no. It's something we're definitely looking at maybe in a future version, but not right now. Question, sir? Okay, the first question is there an API to export and import programmatically? Right now, we are not exposing any APIs or SDKs for AppCenter. We do have that command line, but that's right now as far as we go. Second question? The question is there an interface for drivers? Can I write my own driver so that I can have the SQL driver, which we don't currently have? Unfortunately, the answer to that is also no for this version. We know it's something we want to do in future versions, but for right now, sorry. Question? Can you script app definitions? Oh boy, this is actually an Ori question. I do not know off the top of my head if that's in there or not right now. Other questions? Okay, great. Oh, one question. Yes, ma'am. So the question is, have we done any profiling work to see how often we can replicate content and not seriously adversely affect the website? And the answer is it depends. It really depends on what content and how much content you're replicating. If you have less amount of content, you can replicate more and more often, and we won't even notice. If you're Microsoft.com and you have 40 gigs of content, oh boy, you will definitely notice. What I found with CRS, actually, which is not this product, but it's a previous product, was that in most cases, even if you had a huge website like a Microsoft.com, the amount of changes occurring over time is actually more of a trickle than huge amounts of content. So we found that even in automatic mode, we weren't overburdening the system. So, but it does. We will be very careful about performance and our consumption of memory and disk space and CPU and stuff like that. And that's going to be an ongoing process for AppCenter to make sure that we don't, wipe out machines and stuff like that. Question. Okay, so the question is, if a file is being updated while we're replicating it, will it screw things up? The answer is no, it better not. It would be a bug if it was. We should be able to handle that case because we'll basically read a copy of it, and if it's being updated, it should be okay. I mean, yeah. Other questions? In the back, sir. Is there any system sizing guide? Okay, so the question is there any system sizing guide that says, hey, this machine is taking up too much, or this component is taking up too many resources on this machine, so you should definitely go to, to a second or a third tier? And the answer is it's not going to be part of the product per se, but there will be white papers that help with that sort of problem. Okay, question in the front. Sure. The question is, I talked about this cleanup replication, which happens every 60 minutes, and part of the reason to have that is in case a notification gets missed. And could I please elaborate on what would cause something to get missed? And the answer is kind of hard to give one specific thing, because if we knew what it was, we'd have fixed it already in Windows 2000. The answer really is that a lot of things can occur to make this happen. Usually, I've seen this happen where you're putting the machine under an extreme amount of stress. Thousands and thousands of files are being updated all at once, and it just, NT just doesn't give a change notification in that case. I can't really talk to any other stores like the Metabase or ComPlus apps because they change so infrequently. I'd be very surprised if we would drop anything for those. But for the files, the only thing I've ever seen is when it's been really, really busy. Question? Okay, the question is there a way to back up the manifest or restore it? And the answer actually is no. There is no way right now. I saw another hand go up. Yes, sir. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, so your question is, do we actually use WMI as the transfer mechanism, right, to export the data from the cluster controller to the cluster members? Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. The question is, do we expose WMI events or basically WMI events telling you what's going on with this replication? The answer is yes, absolutely. We fire lots of events. We'll fire events saying, okay, we started. Okay, now we're sending files across. Okay, we're done. Okay, now we're applying files. Okay, now we're really done, type of thing. We'll also send inside of, we'll actually have some events which sort of say, okay, these are how many files we sent across. These are how many bytes that we sent, blah, 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 that sort of thing. Question, sir? Okay, so the question is, let's say I had a cluster and everybody's happy except one of these machines dies for like a day, and I've done like 6 or 7 updates in between time. When I bring that member back online, is it automatically synchronized before it's brought back, and is it brought online? And the answer to that question is that when you bring a machine into the cluster again, or we bring it back online, we will synchronize it, and you have the option whether or not after the synchronization occurs to bring it back online or not. So it's up to you. You could say, okay, I've re-added to the cluster. I think all the content's there, but you know what? I want to double check before I have it serving live content again. So it's up to you. Questions? Sir? The question is that defined by the box that's coming back up? And I believe no. I believe it's actually something, well, when you do it, you actually go through a wizard. And at the last stage of the wizard, you have a box whether or not to bring it back into the cluster or into load balancing. Sir? We have two. The question is, if it's out of service, i.e. not serving web content, it's still being synchronized? And the answer is yes, maybe. It depends. We have 2 settings. We have I'm in or out of the replication loop, which means I'm being synchronized or not. And we have I'm in or out of the load balancing loop. So those are 2 independent settings. So you can do whatever you'd like. You can say, yeah, it's offline, not serving content to the internet, but guess what? It's still being updated, or vice versa, or whatever combination you like. Other questions? Yes?
If you elect not to use NLP,
Uh-huh.
is there a reason why you cannot have AppCenter replicate to heterogeneous servers?
The question is, if you do not use NLB, is there a reason why you can?
You've got an application definition,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got different application replication schedules in your tools.
Mm-hmm.
So why couldn't you have, like, some applications not being replicated to certain servers and still being replicated?
So the question is, if you're not using NLB, could you have like say 6 applications on the cluster controller, only have say 3 of them replicated across the cluster, right? What you're describing there is actually a staging scenario, right? Where you have a stager, which is not part of a cluster per se, but it has like 6, 7, 8, who knows how many applications on it, but it only sends out say 3 or 4 of them to a cluster controller. And then that cluster controller will replicate all of its apps to all the members in its cluster. And the reason we have to have the cluster controller be replicated across all the machines is 1, testing complexity for us, and 2 is you could actually run into some issues with the metabase. We don't have multiple copies of the metabase, so it's possible that you'd have conflicting settings. Yeah. Any other questions? You guys have been great. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any other questions, feel free to come by after the talk and just grab me. Thanks again. Thank you.